All right, I've learned there's a little delay sometimes, so I'm hoping I've waited long enough to say, welcome to Beard Banter. We're on episode 15. I am actually extremely privileged to be sitting here with a good friend of mine, another Matt, another cybersecurity Matt, that we got to build a highly integrated MSP from a security perspective pretty much together. Along with a few other parties and players, including Tony Miller and a few others that we'll talk about today. But essentially, what we want to do today is kind of just reminisce. And I'm stupid happy to have you here, Matt. If you don't mind, take a minute and introduce yourself, kind of tell your background from a technical perspective, and then we'll get into it. So,
Yeah, well, first, I very much appreciate the beard exemption for this show.
it was filed and approved 100%. We've got it documented for compliance reasons. So,
Yeah, really happy to be on with you, Matt. Like Matt said, him and I worked together for quite a while previously. I'm from Rochester, New York. Worked for an MSP there, and have an engineering background and have that typical story of pure engineer who went on to IT governance and security kind of roles after that.
yeah. Yeah. And so you were with Capstone IT, Mike Fowler, Satima Fowler for how long?
So about 12 years.
Yeah. Similar to my world. I was 11 total, I think, at Iconic and former entities. And what's interesting about that for the benefit of the audience that's watching right now is that we both started. At least for me, I started when there were 7 of us. I think I'm not sure where you were, Matt, when you joined, but I imagine it was similar in size of a company.
Yeah, it was really about the same size, and it was really interesting the entire time to watch the way the organization changed and the way that our processes matured as we got bigger and bigger, and eventually became huge after
Yeah.
that. Just
Well, and processes failed, right? Like one of the things that I remember as we went from million in revenue, mostly break fix or block time, right, to transition into seats on a bus and becoming an MSP and driving through that. What's kind of co-tangential about that is while Matt and I only worked together for about 3 years, give or take 2.5 years, our organizations worked together for another 4.5 years before that, all in the same HTG peer group, all in the same, kind of trying to build an organization. And for me, what was interesting is like when it was 7 of us, you had this intimate relationship with your clients, right? You could go have a conversation. You were the guy, pretty much. I was the guy for those clients. And then you watched as like that didn't scale anymore, and you now tried to have help desk that presumed to know these clients. Like I'm assuming you went through some of those same iterations as well.
well, the way I would describe it is we went from not even having processes to having processes and having mature processes at one point, and it's really just amazing the way that you are forced into that as you get bigger, right? When
Yeah.
it's just you have like the Matt client, right? And all the Matt clients
Yeah.
are the same
Yep.
way. And
Yeah.
if I go on vacation or if you go on vacation, it's good luck everybody else. And
Yeah.
as you grow, you're just forced to start maturing and start having standards and processes. So like, forget about even having good processes for a second, just having them.
So that's funny, Matt. Like I've never told this story, I don't think live. I don't know if anybody else has heard this before. But I actually used to, I literally, I was on the leadership team. This was probably when we got to about 3 million or so in revenue, 2 million or so in revenue, 2.5. Um, I literally looked at the rest of our leadership team and said, do we even want to become a process driven company? Like, I swear to God, that was a legit argument I was making to say, no, let's just all hire rock stars. Let's all. But I think you hit the point is that it doesn't scale. Right. And you take opportunities to try to make the same subnet types and put servers at the same IP addresses and do things to normalize names. Like this is a web server. This is an app server. This is a backend SQL database. Like, so you have those things to try to normalize it, over time and have people have similar things. But ultimately you wound up like not knowing the other environment well enough to be able to speak towards it, the nuances, this product doesn't work if you do this, and a lot of those things. And so you're right, process has to start solving a lot of those things as well. So
It's just that out of pure necessity, right? The everybody's a rock star hiring process is actually kind of awesome for a little bit while you're small, except you
yeah,
only find a handful of those guys.
right. What's funny though, the correlation that's interesting to me is that when you start thinking of all those processes, when you start thinking of all the procedures, when you start thinking of all the guidelines and frameworks and controls and things you start building just to meet the need of scaling an offering from a service perspective, you're flexing the same muscles that become the muscles for a security perspective, right? Like, so if you start thinking about that, had we not had the processes, we couldn't have applied them and modified them and held to them, right? And so it's kind of a precursor, and I have to imagine a lot of MSPs are going through that transition, at least into this. Like, it's not just documentation for documentation's sakes. Now I'm doing it for other reasons that get into compliance and things.
Yeah, exactly. You need to be really internalizing this and out of necessity almost. So if you are looking at this list of procedures and policies somebody tells you you have to have, it doesn't really give you much value if you don't see an internal need to have it,
Yeah,
right? So if you're just going through, hey, I need to have these 15 policies because my auditor said so, then you're
yeah,
going to have a really hard time getting that one to be anything that's actually useful to you, and two, even finishing them. And I think that part is equally or more important than what the framework says you have to do. If you are looking at this list, if you're set up the way that works for you operationally, you're going to get the list of requirements from the framework and have to add one thing to it because you're already set
right.
up that way rather than starting from zero.
Well, and the point you're speaking towards too is like, if you write a policy and you don't follow it and it's not a living, breathing document, sure, you checked a box, but it's absolutely useless in defending yourself. And it's absolutely useless in ever even measuring whether you're reducing risk, right? Because that's what most of this is just risk reduction. It's not complete risk avoidance. It's not right. It's literally just making policies and procedures to make risk reduction in some of those things. I want to take a second. Andy, what's up? Fantastic credentials behind your name, brother. Good to see you as well. And then Ethan, of course, always good to see you, my friend. And yeah, process allows you to grow your rock stars. It's funny. So Chris Hoos, Nicholas Herrera in my org in Wichita, as we were going through this journey, used to say, let's take B players and make them A players, right? Let's take C players and make them B players. And I think a lot of the things that come into process allow you to potentially do just that, right? And if you fast forward into a world where, let's say, you were 100% Azure Active Directory bound, you were 100% tied into Intune and Autopilot, you had everything tied in with SAML or OIDC or OAuth into your extensibility with different things. You had as much, SCIM provisioning and deprovisioning as you could implement. As you start getting into that world, like, you start making the process itself be endemic, and now the rock stars can really be business function and can really be talking about risk as opposed to necessarily spinning the plates. And it kind of brings us to the next piece, right? Yeah, Eddie Phillips, 100%. He says, Ethan, ability to follow a process is a rock star trait in itself.
No
Accurate.
kidding.
How many times, Matt, have you made a process and gone, how the hell could you have checked this off on the box because it's not done? Like, you didn't do it.
Well,
Like,
right, it frees up your B players and your C players to behave like A players, like you were mentioning, and your rock stars can spend the time solving business problems and not
yep.
trying to figure
And
out
or
what.
correcting the process, right? And
Yeah,
or modifying those
exactly.
failure points. Yeah,
Right, it's a force
100%.
multiplier for your rock stars.
I love it. So let's talk about this. So we merged. That would have been. Oh wait, hold on. We got a big long one here. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Let's see what this comes up to. Alex Sorrell, super interesting to listen to you guys. As someone who's 3 months into my first help desk role, I really hope you on level one day. You will, Alex, 100%. Like, as long as you care and are driving forward and increasing your skill set, you'll pass me in every way. So, yeah, keep it up, brother. Welcome. That's awesome. Glad. Thank you for saying that. So we merged, right? This would have been May, at the end of May, I think it was, in 2019. And pretty quickly, at least in my role, I was invited to be the director of technology. Obviously politics and all the things that go into that, but that was the role I took, and it was really about selecting our vendor stack, and it was in this one mission. But pretty quickly, as we started going down the path, just for everybody, kind of as a read-in, we decided we wanted to merge and integrate fully. A lot of mergers around our size, because it was 4 companies, all in the 5 to 8 million or so revenue with similar EBITDA margins. We merged them together, but we said, listen, we want to integrate. We want to use the same PSA. We want to use the same RMM. We want to use the same processes. We want to have the same command structure. We want to have the same humans in the offices. We want them doing things the same way, like very deeply integrated. And it allowed us to build a world where we got to focus in a way that I don't think I've ever experienced before, Matt. I mean, some of the things we were able to do is operate with some degrees of principles of least privilege. We're able
Not
to
just
take over.
dumb.
True, not
Yeah,
just some. In fact, you were a big part of selecting some of that stuff, right? Like as we started discussing what should technicians be able to do, that came into some very interesting conversations over the course of several of our hundreds of hours of arguments, didn't it?
I mean,
Um,
but by the time we were done, we had guys had to put in an approval request to run a Firefox extension. It was fantastic.
yeah, it's one of those things where we preach this to our clients and we talk about security. And as an MSP, we say, okay, we want to be secure. Yet as technicians and as engineers, we're often held hostage by the needs of the clients, right? And so it takes shifting that mentality to say, no, maybe your laptop isn't how you're going to do that. You're going to need a jump box in that client's environment. You're going to need something that allows you to separate the attacking of Matt and Matt from the attacking of that client in some extent, right? Like that was what was so cool about that. And yeah.
Yeah, we really internalized the idea that your corporate laptop is not some sandbox to test client things on or to run whatever you need to on. Your corporate laptop is just like any other laptop at a client. You secure it the same way. And if you need to test some random application, you go set up a VM somewhere at a client, or if it's client software, go test it on their network.
Which is hard, right? Because if you think about what is an MSP in the first definition, as we start looking at the economics, as we start looking at the economies of scale, as you start looking at that efficiency and efficacy driving the ability to be more profitable than if someone did. And so you look at what that is, those are antithesis to some of these conversations, right? You mean I've got to spin up a VM that might take me 30, 40 minutes to get this ready and have, and so it forces you to either do one of two things: suck at your job, which is never great, or
Yeah.
plan accordingly more ahead of time with those customers. If you know you're going to need to do some of those things, have the infrastructure. And when you sell that next server, it's going to come with more infrastructure. Or if you have, right. And so you start looking at how that shapes kind of the way those customers have to be modeled in order to deal with, our tightening requirements. But at the same time, while like they're massively behind, right? Most customers don't have even the thoughts of like restricting down, not adding a Firefox add-on. Well, nobody has change control. Those things don't bolt directly into their world, and so, um, yeah, interesting. Sorry.
I think you said it the right way, though. I think what we were doing was forcing ourselves to give internal customers the same answer that we would give a client when it came to security advice. And
Yeah.
it's so easy for you to say, just kind of hand wave it off and think you'll be secure and we won't do anything to ourselves, but really treating yourself um, with the same level of care that you would give a client, and don't just assume that you're okay to do whatever you need to on your own stuff.
Do you remember my seminal email? Were you a recipient of my single greatest fear email?
Yeah, I thought actually that the entire world might have received that.
I did send it to everyone. I was serious about it. It was back when you could still actually email all without some restrictions, right? We even went down that road.
Yeah.
I want to touch on something real quick though. So Benjamin asked a question. So Matt, what's the best way to scale a department to attract the rock stars? Give your shot at this question first.
So if you're here, and this happened to me multiple times, if you have somebody talking about how, hey Matt, you hold this department together and that's what's going on, that is a bad thing. And making that not happen is the answer. The idea is to take the day-to-day cog in the machine that you become and turn that into process and let you be the vision for the department and
Yeah.
automate yourself out of it. And if you can successfully do that and show people who might want to come into it that they'll have the freedom to do that, then you'll get the rock stars.
We talked about burnout a couple weeks ago with Nathan Taylor, and that's a great point there, right? Like, if I am a rock star, I sure as hell don't want to always have the rope over my shoulder carrying it fully. And I think that from an attraction perspective, you hit it right on the head in the sense that if someone could say to me, Matt, I just want your knowledge, I want your vision, I want you to set the processes and drive it, and we'll bring 20 people to go execute it, and we'll be able to empower that. Like, that's attractive comparatively to, hey, you're really good. Come in and carry the scalpel the rest of your life, right? Come carry the rope the rest of your
You
life.
can't
Like,
do that,
yeah.
and like from your own career development, you shouldn't want to do that, right? If you're leading the entire charge and pulling all the weight yourself, while that's awesome and productive, you're going to be stuck doing that yourself forever.
I think there's an egocentrism though to that. And I don't mean it in a negative way. I just mean you care about your work so much that when you're doing your work, at least me, and maybe this is what I tell myself so I don't sound like a total tool, but when I was doing the work, it was just so hard to hand off because I cared so much, right? And I think that was the hardest transition for me of like, I would burn myself out
Yeah.
rather than see it be done poorly. And I know that's stupid because I see it done quite well now, right? And it's not me. And back to your point, you can grow those processes to overcome some of that plate spinning, if you will. But I think that's one of the interesting parts is you fight that if you're a technology person that has grown up in the last 10 years, has basically been there to build it yourself, right? You kind of feel a little bit of a marriage to it. I don't know if you've suffered from that yourself, but I certainly did when we were going forward. So
Yeah, I definitely did, and I got good advice from some of the people we talked about before, from Tony and Satima in particular, that said, "Look, Matt, you just have to be okay with things not being done the way you would do them initially, and just get over it." And
yeah.
man, my life got a lot better once I internalized that.
Did it take a while to swallow that one, or were you okay with
Well,
it?
it did, right? Because you always look at something and you think, "Man, I would have done this differently, or I might have
Yeah,
done
yeah,
this in an hour instead of half an hour." But that's the way to let your team grow and let
yeah.
other people start taking charge of that.
Gosh, we're getting some great comments in here, so I'm gonna let the audience decide where we go with this, right? So, Ethan's spot on. He made this comment earlier, and we were talking about how the efficacy, efficiency aspects of this are somewhat counter thesis, right? In the sense that I'm not going to be as efficient if I have to go build a VM and do some testing on it before I go forward. So the answer is charge the right amount, right? And I think that's a
Yeah.
shifting point. So good point, Ethan. Benjamin answering our question as we answered his was awesome advice. Can't make it reliant on one person. And then it gets back to two comments that stated that, right. So then Eddie says, no one really wants to be the Tom Brady of IT. True, right? Unless you're just wanting to be the Tom Brady of IT. But then Ethan hits it like right on the head of saying, yeah, what if Matt or Matt's comma space get hit by a bus? What happens? And I think what's so cool about where we walked away from Iconic, and I felt okay walking away from Iconic, was that so much of that process, so much of the walls and the rails and the guidelines for the streets were built that like it was fine. It didn't need a me. I mean, did I add value? Yeah, I hope so. But we built it enough that at some point the compliance itself was going to continue, the change motions were going to continue, the security and separations and arguments that we took there were going to continue in their same right. And yeah, but emphasizing if Matt got hit by a bus, do we continue forward? The answer should be we lost vision, we lost the ability to continue scaling and changing, but we are still functional in all the things that exist from process, right? Like in
Yeah,
my mind.
exactly,
So
right. If your processes are set up properly, you can disappear for a while, and all that happens is the, you know, 2-year
the
plan that you
growth.
had doesn't
Yeah,
materialize.
exactly. Yeah. And I think that's the point you're making too. That was also one of those things that's taken for granted a lot. We were in a massive circular reference loop of correction and getting better and growing and meeting new needs and chasing SOC 2 type 1 and SOC 2 type 2 and then chasing like as you see that, like that's the piece that it frees up your rock stars to do, right? That's the piece that it frees up to say, okay, we're already here. What do we have to do to iterate? Right? There's a pretty big cliff coming, I think, in technology, in the sense that a lot of the value MSPs had was in plate spinning and keeping technologies that have a lot of failure points functioning and backed up and secure. And it's now shifting to I just use Salesforce Online and I just
Yeah,
use Microsoft
right.
as an identity source. Like that's a much different world in how you go forward. And I think it takes a lot more of those rock stars leading the change to find where that next value is and how we move from this one big behemoth to that. Yeah.
You know, Mike always described this as moving up the stack, and it's kind of cliche to this point, but
It is, but
it's
still
really
true.
right.
Yeah.
It's really true. If you're out there leading with, yeah, I'm going to keep all your stuff patched and updated and do the install. I mean, that also needs to be
We're
done,
called
but
table stakes now. Like
right,
that's
that's
yeah,
all.
yeah.
Yeah, we'll help your business, and yeah, we'll also take care of the patching too, as an aside.
Yeah. That's stuff we do. Like, yes, we got it, but it's endemic to the way we do our business, right? Like, and then Charlie said, it's hard to realize that others can probably help do it so much better together rather than just on your own. I would agree with that. I think there's also a thinness in what you do in an MSP, and even before that, when it was break fix, like it was very much this very intimate one-to-one scalability with that client to some extent. And when you try to carve that out now and say, I have a help desk. I have a frontline technicians. I have a network administrator. I have a system admin. I now have a backup administrator. I now have a security professional. I now have like all those things. You're 100% right. To scale it, Charlie, I think you absolutely have to be able to do that in a role-based function that allows for that collaboration and continued teamwork. But you still have to have the frameworks to make sure that things are done somewhat uniformly in some ways. So,
That's one of
yeah.
those things that you start to learn to let go of as your organization grows more. when
Yeah, you can't do it all at some
right,
point. It's
those 7
impossible.
employee days, yeah, you were going to the client's Christmas party, and, like, you were really you knew these guys like the back of your hand,
It was
and
intimate. I mean, they were your
it
friends.
was.
You make up for mistakes. They would make up for your burden. They'd make up for your inability to respond because they were your friend
Yeah,
in a
and
lot of
right,
ways.
there's some good things about that, but the reality is you have to get to the point where your organization is supporting the client, not you
Amen.
supporting the client.
And it's tough. I mean, that's a tough transition. We both went through that a bit in a vacuum, and then went through that massively in the new entity, right? And how that changed everything, and how much do we change in geolocal space? What does Rochester do different than Dallas? What has to be accounted for that in the market, and differences there as well. So,
Yeah.
all right, Jessica says. I think it also helps to recognize that many times there are already rock stars within an organization. I would agree with that. You don't always need to look for the bright green grass outside the gates and end up neglecting taking care of your own lawn. Well said. Yeah. And I think also you might identify the traits that make a rock star. And if you can do that, you can grow them. And obviously in this limited resource market, I was just talking about this with Project Management International in California a little bit ago. You almost have to start looking for the ones you can create into this, and the ones that will grow into that space and maybe have vision but don't have confidence, and maybe have vision without the technical capabilities behind it that need to be married. And you can start, where do I need to focus on growing some of these things for someone? So brilliant point as usual, Jessica. Thank you. This is actually a great one, Matt. Have you ever done this? I still have to keep myself from grabbing help desk tickets where I know the freaking answer. Like, I just know it. I could solve it in 3 seconds. Not my job anymore, which isn't the way I would say it, but it's also saying it doesn't let the other people grow. In fact,
Yeah.
I got pointed at this from Nicholas Herrera, and I'm not sure if you got this on your side, but one of the times in the beginning of my career, the reason I think I became so successful is I just said yes, always. There was a project to be done tonight. Yes. If there was a problem somebody else was having, yes. If someone was off, yes. It was always yes. And I grew so much through it, and I learned so much through it. But then afterwards, I became an easy point to solve problems. And so people would come to me that instead of even spending any time trying to figure it out and go, Matt, do you know the answer? And I would just know the answer. And it was almost instant. And that was great. But all I ever had at my desk every day was, hey, Matt,
Yeah, no
hey,
kidding.
Matt. And they didn't grow. And as a result, I gave them the easy answer, and they never got forced to do the same stuff that I did and fight through it and learn things, be able to manipulate them in your head so you can see them and how they interact. Like, it's robbing them of that.
I
um,
got quote unquote in trouble for doing that too much. Um, but think about it this way, right? When I started and when you started, I'm sure too, neither one of us were that guy on day one.
no,
And we
no, I
never
was an
would have
idiot.
been that guy if everyone just grabbed everything and didn't say, hey, go figure it out. We were
True
fortunate
story.
to benefit of other people who recognized the need to do that, to let us grow and to let us fail too.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's funny. So Eddie Phillips has a comment we'll get to here in a second too. But I do agree, Andy. Like, it's a tear, because you're like, I care about that customer suffering at the end. I care about that person sitting there trying to get their financial report done that my technician's trying to solve, but they need that growth curve, and that person's suffering. And I think that, at least if you're an empath in some way, you kind of feel that, then yeah, 100%, man. You just want to solve the suffering. And I think it takes a lot of maturity to understand your people need to grow too. And so where's that balance, right? How do you play with that balance a little bit?
Yeah,
But
it does take some experience. In a situation like that, there is a point where you do need to jump in and solve the problem if they've been spinning their wheels too long. But
yeah.
it takes some experience to know when that is and to let it be a development project
A-
without
a-
hurting the customer.
And then you start saying, okay, can we set parameters that set timelines so that people have an automatic clock and an automatic escalation and an automatic, like, and so that's what we ultimately got to, right? You're only going to work a help desk ticket for 27 minutes, and you're going to transfer it to your IA, and then you're going to move it to a sys. Like, that hierarchy was getting established to allow for a systemic methodology to try to be not having that person wait for a whole time. Although, you know how it goes sometimes, right? 30 minutes can feel like forever if it's the wrong 30 minutes. So you can't be perfect with it, but we did try to establish those things, at
Yeah,
least in our orgs.
no,
Um,
we did.
this one talks about Bob's Law. So I'm in Bob Coppedge's office. I might as well reference Bob's Law. I actually gave a stage presentation at Channel Partners last week about this. But you're getting commoditized. As an MSP, every year, 5% of what you do is commoditized, right? And so this speaks back to, we used to configure IRQ ports on cards. We do not. We have USB. right? We used to do things, and every day gets more commoditized. We used to run Exchange servers. You had to have a spinning platter for the C drive. You had to have RAID 10 for the D drive for your actual Exchange database. You needed a RAID 10 for your log files or whatever it might be. And so you like had to manage those things. It was all part of the design. It was all part of the failure. It was all part of the infrastructure and the hardware you needed and all the VM. Like now I buy a $20 Microsoft Office 365 license, right?
Right.
And
If
that's
you see one of
commoditization.
those servers around, your advice now is to get rid of it.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you think about that and start spreading that same concept across almost everything we do, we are being commoditized in what our value prop used to be, right? As MSPs, we'll keep the lights on, we'll make the servers run, we'll keep. And I think speaking towards Eddie's comment, it really is that not only will it keep the lights on, we have to do that. How do you develop and mature? How do you add value? And if we look back, I bet we could come up with those points in our world. Like, when did you add strategic services at Capstone? Right? Like, that you called it that you differentiated for a VCIO and they were going to drive forward strategy and business operations and talk. And so, like, those things developed as we started being commoditized. Like, we had to find value and competition and those things. And that next piece has been cybersecurity. That next piece has been, this understanding of the burden of risk that we've created. And we being the general editorial sense, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's cybersecurity. It's being willing and able to get involved enough in your customer businesses to be able to make real recommendations for them. And what I don't mean is going down your sheet and saying, okay, we got to get every client to 365. That's not
Right.
the kind of recommendation. It's
Nope.
helping the client understand how technology can really help them. And it sounds like this kind of generic thing that everyone says, but if you're rockstar people, the rare people who can talk business and tech, get involved enough with the customer, they can make those recommendations, and they can do that because they're not spending their entire day putting out fires.
Yeah. And you're hitting towards something, right? At some point, the tech becomes ubiquitous. If I was selling Angry Birds for $1.99 on a phone, I don't have a lot of explanation of the technology. I don't have a lot of explanation of how it's going to function. I don't have a lot of delineation on how it could even be rolled out. It's just going to be an app on this phone and it's going to be consumed, and that's how it's going to be consumed, right? That's why we were able to buy it from the App Store, install it, and use it ourselves. I'm being a little bit, summative and hyperbolous on this, but that's where tech is going. You won't have to know the tech down the road, right? And what I mean is, it's kind of like, in my opinion, you start seeing this world where if everybody's either on Google Cloud and Google for their identity, or Okta for their identity, or Office 365 for their identity and productivity, then now those are the same tools for every customer. They're all the same. The tech doesn't have to be learned more than once. Its capabilities, its applicability, those things are fairly linear at that point. They're a very limited number of variables. And so I think that the ones that'll be successful will actually be the ones that can talk the business part about it, and the technology bolts already kind of look the same, right? And so you don't have as much training on the technology as you did 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, we're already getting to that point. It's obviously not there yet, but the writing is on the wall as far as the technology goes. So if we think about cloud services, neither you nor I can tell you how Amazon or Microsoft or whoever manages their hypervisors,
Nope.
and we just don't care because we're
Yeah.
after the service behind it.
And we've transferred that risk in a shared model to some extent. And yes, we could get into the finer arguments for hundreds of hours of whether or not that's screwing us, but I don't think it changes the market momentum. And I don't think it changes to a point where you're like, you know what, we're going back to servers. We're going to run all Linux because it's open source. We're going to do it. You have business complications with that make your competitor faster for not doing those things, right? So we have Tarek here. I hope I said it right. It might be Tarek. I apologize if I'm wrong. I'm glad you're able to join this webinar. I can relate to almost every single word you mentioned, Matt. And what's great is he can go comma space Matt, and it encompasses both of us, right? Like, there's
Right.
just the Matts. In fact, one of the things I've got to go to my grave with is I was the first Matt to come in the corporate side. So you came in as topper for a good 2.5 years.
It's just one of those names where like Topper is what I became known as everywhere I've ever worked.
Yeah, yeah. Because there's always another Matt, and it just makes
Yeah,
it
yeah,
easier. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, but I don't know how strangely I've walked through life not ever being called Lee. So it might be something about my loud personality might be the point, but arrogance maybe even. But so as we go through that and we're putting things together at Iconic, what was really cool about it was, like, for me, I quickly realized our vendors couldn't support the asks, right? And I won't name any of them specifically, but the vendors themselves, and I started developing this theory, right? Like I'd go to a vendor and say, hey, we're trying to go towards our SOC 2. We really need you in single sign-on. And more importantly, we need you in single sign-on with us having some control of the role-based access and having some control of provisioning users. And right. So we had this bare minimum, but we also had like these things that were like, hey, you need to be marching towards this. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, thanks, Ethan. Ethan said, what loud personality? Can't believe it. Yeah, true story. I'm quiet as a mouse. But I realized that, and so one of the things that when I pitched my role at Iconic, coming from Choose Networks, was I want to be able to start getting myself on every single vendor advisory panel of companies we spend X dollars with. And I want to be able to talk to them about these things and bring up my concerns and shape their future and drive them towards a new accordance. And so, I spent a lot of my time shaking hands and babies. I think the baby shaking I'd like to regret now that it's been a few years, but shaking hands. And I took this strategy of like being very publicly positive about these vendors, right? Building their sales up, helping them in their sales motions, being a speaker for them. And the reason was I needed to be able to hit them with the stick privately. I need to be able to say, no, this is horse crap that you don't have a SAML-based access for me or OIDC. Like, no, I understand you have 15 years of tech debt you haven't solved, but I have to do two things: get you the revenue to solve it and ensure you spend it on solving it. And so I spent a lot of time in that, and to varying degrees of success, right? Like, sometimes it was successful, sometimes it was a total flop.
Well,
Um,
the ones that we really connected with, we were able to see them get better as we got better. It was super, super cool.
It was cool. Yeah. Learning together and sharing that experience with that vendor. I mean, at the end of it, Matt, and you stayed a little longer than me, but at the end of it, we had like 67 applications or something in some form of single sign-on, right? Like it was everything we touched had pretty well been integrated to be single sign-on, almost. I mean, where we could. Um,
We had
you know,
very few exceptions and got to the point where an exception really was an exceptional thing. It was a big deal for something to not have SSO.
yeah.
And due to scale, we were able to say to vendors, look, we're just not
I'm
doing
not going to
it.
spend this $1 million with you. Sorry. Your call. In fact, there was a vendor that this was a little hyperbolous, but this vendor comes in and says, hey, listen, we'll build our cloud, we'll fix our single sign-on, but we need to get the revenue attached to this to get our dev teams to do the sprints, right? Like to fix the work. And it was a year. Like we gave them a year, Matt, I think is what it was. And it was funny because they come to me about midstream and they're like, okay, how many units of this are you going to buy if we fix this? And I said, well, you're going to hold me to that? Like, this is a whole fleet. I have operational challenges. I have contractual challenges to fix. Like, this is going to take a minute. These were hardware devices, right? And then the question was, were you going to hold me to this? And their answer was, oh, no, no, no. We just need to get this ahead of other stuff in productivity that has higher revenue attached to it. Right. Like, so you see the problems that exist that, I bring that up just to say that they didn't hit the mark. Ultimately, I think they got close to the mark. We did have single sign-on. We didn't have some of the other improvements, but it was just interesting that the revenue that was tied to that is to help them overcome their own challenge to see where the market is moving. Just because I'm here early, I'm not special. Right? Everybody else is going to figure this out. The other MSPs are going to get more and more mature. They're going to start asking the questions. So I'm really trying to help you with your revenue down the line that you can't attach to this directly.
Yeah, and that's the key thing, right? We may have been, so I won't claim to be the first, but early on the
We're
curve with
early.
MSPs asking for this type of thing. And from the vendor perspective, that's going to become not just, your top MSPs are asking that. That just
It's
becomes
going
you
to be the
need to
bell
have this
curve.
to have anyone,
Yep.
right? Anyone but like the newest guy on the block needs to have that. And even
Yep.
they'll need it before too long.
Well, and it's going to start becoming, litigious. I mean, you're going to start seeing the ability to sue someone for some of these things. You're going to start seeing, in fact, who was it? I just read one today. There was a lawsuit against a medical provider just for not putting in enough adequate controls. There wasn't actually and they're taking it to court. I mean, it's for $400 million or something. It was ridiculous. But anyways, we're going to start seeing the pressures continue to shift this, and being on the front of that vanguard and having those conversations. Like I had people look at me like I was the biggest idiot in the world. I had vendors go, no, we're not doing that. Nobody's asking for it. I understand. Nobody's asking you yet. You just have to trust me on good faith that they will. And it's kind of neat to watch that play out. And maybe even, I think we all deal with some degree of imposter syndrome, right? I think especially in the higher levels of driving security when nobody else is doing it, for me, there was a fair degree of maybe I'm an idiot. maybe I am asking things that nobody else will ever ask. And when those things start changing, you actually start seeing some of the predictions come true. It's like, well, that's validating. Like,
Right.
that's a couple years later. I used to make a joke, right? That the nice thing about being in the 2 to 3 year space, which is what I considered myself in, is where do we go in the next 2 to 3 years? Was that I had a great job security because nobody knows you're an idiot for like 2 years, right? Like it's pretty nice. But anyways, yeah,
But you kind of mentioned something in that it almost doesn't matter if nobody else ever asks it, because what you need to be doing is your own risk assessment, right? So if you decide that in order for us to feel like we've successfully mitigated this risk down enough, then you need to do X, Y, and Z vendor, and that's all that matters as
yeah.
far as you and your own organization goes. And every other consulting company, MSP, is doing that same type of assessment, or should be.
Well, and here's the cool part about it. Right now, the legal barrier to entry is reasonable person. That's it. It's actually reasonable man, but I try to be inclusive, right? And so the point is that like if 12 people in a box agreed that you did what any reasonable person would do around a very hard to understand technology problem, then you win. And so I think to your point, whatever your risk model is, whatever you as an MSP are willing to accept as risk, do it, execute it, work towards it, show proof of it, right? Because it comes down to the defensibility. If you can show that you had 72 vendors, 35 of them didn't meet your requirements from a security perspective, I documented those, I talked to them, here's the documentation, I fired them, I moved forward, or I fixed it and they fixed it. That's reasonable person. If you can show that you have any educated level of an attempt in some iterative fashion to
Yeah.
secure yourself to a barrier you're willing to sit at, then that's success in the courts today.
The thing
Uh,
that's starting to change is the definition of reasonable. In
True.
that, if you were to be involved in litigation today around like a BEC, for example, you could not easily justify not having MFA on the account anymore.
That's exactly right, right? Like there are certain barrier standards that have to start existing. And then the hard part about this, like just tangential, is that if that shifted, and let's say it's MFA or let's say shifted to SSO, you then also have the vendors saying, oh, you got to step up to our enterprise product to get that. And if you boil that down, the reason for that is we've got enough technical debt that for us to put that on, we actually had to spend $300 million in sprint cycles and all these things. So like, we're going to charge enterprise for that. I'm looking at you, Monday.com. I think there's tons of them out there, right? If you go to sso.tax, that's a
Yeah,
great
there's
site to look
tons.
at that. Yeah. But it speaks towards the endemic nature of this one theory that I kind of developed over time. And I may be right, may be wrong, but I believe that in any immature market, right, in any market where someone is making a product and the person consuming that product is not mature enough to understand the product, is not mature enough to be able to ask the questions about the product only rises to the level of maturity consuming it, right? To the most part, to the need. The nobody's asked me that. I haven't been told I needed that. We couldn't invest. So you're seeing this point where the me and you are maturing. Like I was stupid 10 years ago. I did stupid stuff. I opened firewall rules. I didn't have MFA. I used the same password in an algorithmic fashion, right? We used, 316 CNI, something
Yeah,
like we used
sure.
in, like we were idiots, right? Thank you, Andy, for posting that for me. And so like I don't want to like act like I'm in this sanctimonious position where I've always understood security. Nope. Total idiot. Been an engineer, created many problems, probably created some loss. And I think the point is that people are iterating, people are growing, right? And people are starting to learn those things. And as that market matures, and as you see people go, hey, vendor Y, can you tell me about your software development lifecycle? I'd really love to know. Are you using ephemeral workloads or are you using a monolithic application you haven't touched in 15 years other than to add the new features to it? Help me understand your rewrite and what are you changing from the fact that now we are looking at serverless and we are looking at hybrid? Do you have expansibility in other clouds? Like those kind of questions are mature questions that I wouldn't have asked 10 years ago. I wouldn't have asked 7 years ago, but I started asking them 4 years ago, 3 years ago. And it was ahead of its curve. And people are saying, I'm not going to tell you that. I want you have to sign an NDA and then but you're now seeing a lot of people lead with their architecture. A lot of people are leading with the reason they are actually more secure, that we did build our code in ways that make sense. So we are thinking about privacy up front, that we are thinking about, should I collect that data? Right.
Right. I mean,
Um,
it takes a maturity in your customer base to start driving these organizations and these vendors towards um, making security, right? So in our example from before, nobody's charging extra for MFA now because nobody would buy the product without it. And
exactly. Yeah.
SSO will get the same treatment.
At some point it'll just become endemic. And I think that's the interesting part, is that while that's happening, there's a lot of loss, right? And I think one of the things Nathan said to me that stuck, Nathan Taylor in our Beard Banter a couple weeks ago, was, Matt, like, while you get up and demonstrate, modern attack surface and new vulnerabilities and the things I do to try to make the awareness, he's like, to me, every single one of them is crippling. He said, every time you bring one of those out, it hurts a little more, because I know this weekend might be the weekend I'm having to rush through this. This might be the right. And so you start looking at that. The loss is real. And so it's driving this acceleration, I think, in some of these conversations, right? Like, yeah. So what did Andy say here? So smart MSPs may even start to see that being upfront with their security architecture and being open about it is a competitive differentiator. Yeah,
Yeah,
100%,
for
Andy.
sure.
If you could walk in and say, here's the CIS top 18, I cover 1 through 5 of these for you natively. I can get you squared away on 7 and 2. And like, if you walked into that, you have this empirical delineation of, not only can I help you get through this, but let me talk to you about my story, right? Like, let me talk to you about why Iconic was so much different than where we started at Choose, right? Because we actually did have it to where a technician, there's Dom, a technician might not be able to actually reset a password through their lab tech interface. They might not be able to actually reboot a server. Well, but we might need it. Yep. And we can do that on demand, and we can add roles. And, one of the things you and I came up with together, I don't want to steal the thunder, Tony Miller. Anytime you hear Matt and Matt in these references, I'm also referencing my VP of operations, Tony Miller. He was the reason we were able to do these things. Like, I don't want to steal too much from that. He fought the fights I couldn't and wouldn't fight upscale, and was just an awesome petri dish for the growing of what we created, I think, if you will. But one of the things we created was this security score, right, Matt? If you remember, it was a 1 through 5. And its intention was to say 1 through 3, this is your types of things you can do. 4 means you're now global, right? Because we had different states and we had different organizations. And so if someone crossed from Florida to Texas, then they now were a 4, no matter what,
Yeah.
because they had more risk. They could touch more systems. They could do more things. And so we started establishing that security score to say, man, you're not really ready to be a 3. You're going to have to be a 2, which means you're going to have somebody else do these functions for you, because we can't share that with you. You haven't grown from a security perspective. And I thought that was really cool. Like, the ability to set roles based on the permission levels and what its risk was. But you kind of
You
helped come
know,
up with that.
it was kind of cool, right? I think we called it tier-based access control, which was we were so big on limiting access to internal resources, right? So if you were in the Rochester office, you shouldn't be accessing things in the Wichita office unless you really need to.
Yeah.
So what we would do was assign roles to specific tiers and then have a geographical fence around them, not in the sense of like IP geofencing, in the sense
Yeah.
of limited access permissions.
Well, and what it came down to, like, if you're trying to focus on what the thought process was, we started with a thought exercise. If I'm a threat actor and I compromise Johnny, what do I have access to? And how do I make that defensible? If the answer is 670 companies, not defensible. If the answer is only the companies that I am responsible for, and if so, that's it, and it's audited and I can prove, that's a much more defensible answer and reasonable person. I didn't give the threat actor that compromises Johnny because he's going to, right? I'm subject to being compromised. I'm a
Mhm.
human. I'm fallible. It's all possible. There's technical flaws. There's other things. And so we just assumed compromise. I actually called this living compromised, if you recall. That was my term that I kind of made up, was live compromised. Live with the understanding that someone's going to compromise you. And if you do that, you start putting in things that restrict the damage. I just wanted it to be less than my insurability. That was it. Yeah, I wanted those 7 clients suing me, not 700.
Well, and one
Um,
of the coolest things we did in that vein is that one of the 670 companies was not Iconic.
Amen. Yeah, if you guys, Matt, that's the most important point I think we've made this whole hour. We treated ourselves differently. We treated ourselves outside. We were in different systems. We were in different administrative consoles. We were in different connections. We were in different, sometimes to our own chagrin. Like, sometimes it screwed us, right? Because the vendor couldn't give us 2 portals, or we couldn't manage SSO in 2 portals, or we couldn't,
Right, right.
right? So some of those things became real problems, right? But it's a brilliant thing to say, is that we had an internal IT staff for us. We had people that managed us, that had rights to us, and the technicians didn't. And the people delivering service didn't, right? If you remember, we had the clear line of separation of internal IT and security teams runs the identity, and the people delivering the service, lab tech, the external tools, they were just consuming our allowance of those identities,
Yeah,
right?
I
Like,
like to say
yeah,
that we were not our own client. Like we
yeah,
really weren't.
it's fantastic. Yeah, and that's tough to do at small scale for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that was a benefit of having the scale that we did, but
Yep.
from a
But
security
you could do
perspective,
it even
it's
in
awesome.
strategic alliances with other MSPs, right? You could even potentially manage some of those things in a way where you're each other shifting those roles and responsibilities. So there's other strategic partnerships that play out pretty well too.
And nothing
Um,
prevents you from having multiple identities, right? So if you are, you don't
switch
necessarily have to
hats.
have 2 people. You take
Yeah.
off your client hat and put in your internal hat and make sure the permissions don't overlap.
Well, and we even had that from the beginning. Our admins were separate users. Our admins were separate identities. I was MattLee admin, not just admin, right? And I didn't
Right,
just have
right.
rights, and I didn't PAM it. I even had to PAM some of the things in our side, like on the admin side. And so, I think the point was what was so neat for me, and the reason why I just love you so much is we literally just got handed piles of Legos and built basically the same castles, and it worked out really well. It was very interesting to work with you in that regard. Two more topics to touch on, then we got to end this because we're at the end of our stream time. Eddie says, ideally, we draw much attention to this that we get vendors to self regulate. Yeah, bro. You and me both. I'm actually working on two separate projects right now on self regulation. I don't know if I'm ever here when the density gets met. I'm never right about the time, just usually the what. But I do think there's no way we could actually have this be legislatively regulated fully. Body of evidence changes too fast. The body of what we do changes too fast. It's kind of like AMA. It's kind of like the Bar Association. It's kind of like FINRA. Same conversations where you have some government allowance to say we can self-regulate, but then the body of that work, the knowledge body, is a CSA or CIS or a CompTIA or some amalgamation of those. So, totally agree, bro. You and I are on the same page. Last piece was also by job role. I've seen many cases where account managers having full RMM access.
Oh,
Yeah, no, we didn't let them do that. Not at all. They did not have RMM access, if I recall, Matt, at all. We the
I think
an
they could
account
run a
manager.
report or something,
That
and
was it. Yeah,
that's it.
yeah, it was it. And even then, it was sparingly and thoughtful. And so I think that's your point, though, Dom. And some of the things that I deal with in my career, kind of where I sit, is this they're maturing through some of the same things that I've already been through, right? That Matt and I, when we went for our SOC 2, were you there when we got our first SOC 2 from the company we bought, Matt Topper?
Yes.
And how much it just caved my heart in. Like when I read it, it was like, man, they've got a SOC 2 type 1. This is so great. It's only scope to manage.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
like, what? How does this even make sense? That's not security. And so when we did it, you and I took every tool we touched and touched the surface of a client and added that to our SOC 2 under scope.
I mean,
We had
that's
to
the thing
pencil
with
whip some
SOC
of it,
2,
but yeah,
right? You can't just yeah, I bet there are cases all the time where the SOC 2 comes from someone, it's not even read, and it's like, yeah, they have a SOC 2. But that's one of those compliance frameworks where you have to really understand how it was scoped to know if it was effective or not.
true story. You can pencil whip the crap out of a SOC 2 for sure. So, but in the absence, right, of people having noses, the person with a nose wins, right? Like, and so it's kind of one of those things where it dawned on me how bad this was, and I'll end with this, but we got this 357 question cybersecurity questionnaire from a client's business partner, and they're like, "Listen, we'll take a SOC 2 in lieu of this." But the questions being asked over here were very security oriented. They really mattered. They would get to the meat of whether this actually did a damn thing to protect you. SOC 2 could be written in a way that doesn't achieve those objectives in any way. Right. And it can be scope whipped into a point where if you only scoped manage, then the RMM security wouldn't matter. It's not part of that scope, but people will take that SOC 2 in lieu of questions that would ask that. And so that's what broke my heart about
Right?
security versus compliance.
You ever get
Um,
somebody who said, "Yeah, we're compliant. Our application is hosted in Azure,"
yeah.
and that's
Right. They're SOC 2, so we're good. What? Yeah, it breaks it. Yeah, anyways. But you and I saw that, and I want to give credit to this because Matt principally ran our entire push towards SOC 2 Type 1 and the beginnings of SOC 2 Type 2 as we were going down that path. That was your world. You owned it, and I think it was amazing. I never could have done it. I'm not as good as you at that for sure. I
well,
can't
and
check
we
the
did it right.
boxes.
We had seen the kind of garbage that we sometimes saw in SOC 2 reports and said, "We don't want to be that. We want to do this the right way."
It was so fun, man. Well, listen, I didn't expect this hour to go by like in 7 seconds, but it seems like we're done here. So I'm at the end of my time. I want to be respectful of everybody's time that's here. Brandon, fantastic to see you, bro. Hope to have you on sometime soon. I did not ignore you. I will get back to you on that conversation. Been a crazy travel time. So, Matt, I love you. I appreciate everything you do. I'm happy to see you at Gradient. I think they earned a top tier rock star that I hope to be one day. I might have some of the other skills that you lack, but you whoop me in a lot of ways. So it's a hell of a grab.
Well, thanks for having me, man. It's been great talking to you.
See you, everyone.